Hi everyone, welcome to the December 3rd edition of the TimeformUS Forecast. I'm David Aragona here with my usual co-host Craig Milkowski, and this week the focus is Aqueduct on Saturday, where they are running the final Grade 1 race of the season in New York. That is the Cigar Mile, and it's a really great card. We've got 4 graded stakes that close out the day, the Demoiselle and the Remsen for the 2-year-olds, along with the Go for Wand for the older fillies and mares. All of those races are part of the late pick 5 sequence, and that's what we're going to be focusing on this podcast. Craig, not necessarily a bunch of full fields through this sequence, but I wouldn't say that there are any really heavy favorites that are going to be obvious singles. You can make some cases for a few different horses in a lot of these races.
Yeah, I would agree with that. It's a sequence that I admittedly struggled with coming up with too many clever ideas. I'd imagine this is a sequence I'm going to wind up playing a pretty short ticket, hoping to be right on some of my opinions. I don't love a lot of what you would call price horses I get. There's a couple I'd use, but none I really want to latch on to. So decent sequence. I don't think it's going to pay boxcars by any means, largely because, as you mentioned, the fields aren't very big. And I think most of the contenders are pretty logical.
Yeah, I pretty much felt the same way. I wouldn't say that there's an obvious single in the sequence, but I think that there are a lot of logical horses that you'd kind of have to sift through. And then you get to the Cigar, which is just as fascinating an 8-horse Grade 1 field as you're going to come across. You can make a case for a lot of horses in that race. We'll get to that, obviously, at the end of the show, Craig. But let's start things off with the first leg of this sequence. It is race 6, a maiden special weight going 6 furlongs on the outer turf course for the 2-year-olds, and it's really not the toughest maiden special weight that you're going to see in New York. I think you've got some clear-cut contenders among those with experience, and then there are a few first-time starters that I suppose you could make a case for. But for me, Craig, the conversation kind of started with the number 6 Urban Forest. Comes out of the same race last time as the number 5 Carpe's Dream, but when I went back and watched that race, Urban Forest was the one that I know that I wanted out of there.
Yeah, he definitely had some trouble in the race. He kind of got shuffled back early, made a nice run. I mean, he did get a good inside trip. He never really lost any ground. But I'll be honest, if I'm going to play this race, is this a sequence I want to start with him on top? I have my doubts about that because I think he's going to get bet pretty heavily. I mean, you do have him pegged as a morning line favorite. And I do think there are some horses that could beat him. So he's certainly going to be on my ticket. Um, I will use the horse that beat him last time, Carpe's Dream, the 11 horse, who, I thought he ran a good race in there. He chased the favorite all the way around, wasn't able to quite get him. But I do think a couple of the first time starters are also interesting. Obviously, I have the horse drawn inside. He's the 2 horse because there's a coupled entry with one of the AEs in here, but Fiery Heart. Um, Chucka Moon, the 3 horse, is another first time starter that I found a little bit interesting from Mark Hennig. Admittedly, not a specialty of his sending horses out, but I do like that he gets Ortiz on him, Jose Ortiz for the ride. And then I do like a bit of a price horse in here who's drawn more towards the outside for Kelly Breen. And it's merely because he does really well with second time starters. This one's a little bit muddled because he does so coming off a long layoff. But it's a stat that I still like to use. And he's a horse that took a lot of money first out, and that's the 8-horse You Can't Whip It. But a race that I don't want to rely on the favorites because I'm going to be using some short prices. Shorter, not like you said, no heavy favorites in here, but it's one where I'd like to catch a little more.
Yeah, I have a bit of a difference of opinion in this race. This is one of the few spots in this sequence where I thought I could really lean on the horse, and that is the number 6, Urban Forest. I mean, just to kind of expound on what you were saying, I didn't think the pace of that race that he comes out of was that fast. I know that the pace figure suggests it was pretty even throughout, but it was a race that was dominated towards the front end, and Urban Forest just kind of got pushed in a few strides out of the starting gate, was farther back than I think his connections really wanted to see him that day. And if you look at the chart and watch the race, there was nobody making up much ground at all that day, and Urban Forest made a good late run coming up the inside. He saved ground, but I don't think it's ideal to make that closing run up the rail, and he was finishing best of all at the end. I believe he was the best horse that day, and I think if he gets a fair trip and a clean break here, he's going to be tough to beat. We'll see who rides him, because if you're following Twitter this morning as we record this on Friday morning, it was just announced that Joel Rosario sustained a fractured rib when a spill at Aqueduct yesterday, so he will be off all of his mounts for this weekend and for the next few weeks as well. So he's going to get a rider switch. We'll see who ends up aboard Urban Forest, but I just think if he gets a fair trip, he's going to be pretty tough for this field to handle, because I actually think he's a decent turf horse in a race where the others, there's a lot of filler in here, let's put it that way. And the other ones that I'd want to use behind Urban Forest as backups are those first-time starters that you mentioned, Craig, the number 2 Fiery Heart, who does not have a ton of pedigree for turf, but I think it's interesting that Todd Pletcher elects to run him on this surface. It seems like he's been working okay. He did achieve that 2-year-old sales work on the dirt at Gulfstream when he sold for $475,000, but he looked good doing it. Some of the outworks, the progeny of that sire, they've had success on the turf, so I think he might get enough influence from that sire. And then the other one that you mentioned, Craig, who'll probably be a bigger price, is the number 3 Chukka Moon. This horse's dam was best on turf and synthetic surfaces. The Malibu Moons, they can be somewhat versatile. The dam, actually, she's a half-sister to Palace Malice, and while Palace Malice was a dirt horse, he's one that has been effective himself as a sire of some turf horses. So I think there's some influence there. And if you look up the stats of Mark Hennigan Formulator, the numbers that kind of jump out at you, 1 for 37 with first-time starters on turf, it seems like a real negative. But if you kind of dig through the runners in that sample, a ton of huge prices. And actually, Mark Hennig has hit the board, finished 2nd and 3rd with some very big prices as first-time starters on the turf. So I wouldn't be too down on those statistics. And I think Chukka Moon's a little bit interesting. I mean, Carpe's Dream, he ran fine last time, but he was 28-1 that day. He's going to be a fraction of that here. I think that Urban Forest is just a better horse than him, and the others were just tough for me to get a handle on. Personally, I could not get to the horse that you mentioned, Craig, for Kelly Breen. I just didn't really see the turf pedigree there, aside from the fact that he's a Cantharos. And like I said, the others, they just seem like they're kind of a cut below what you'd usually find at this level.
Yeah, I don't have any problem with anything you said. That's why I keep you around. You do the pedigree work and the trainer work. I'm like that kid at school that's really good at math and loves the class, but when it comes to English, he doesn't want to do his homework. So that's why we pay you the big bucks.
Let's move on to the second leg of this sequence, the Grade 3 Gopher Wand handicap, going a mile on the dirt, 1-turn mile, it should be noted. And I think that's important because there are a few horses that are stretching out trying to get this distance, horses coming out of sprint races, and maybe they can stretch out that extra furlong going this 1-turn configuration. And Craig, I do think we kind of have to start the conversation with the number 2, Lady Rocket. From a class and speed figure standpoint, she really is kind of a standout in this race. She's faced the best horses. She comes in with some of the best speed figures. It's just, do you want her at a short price trying to negotiate this distance for the first time?
Yeah, that's a tough call. I mean, it would seem to me she certainly has the breeding to do it, but she hasn't really run like a horse that wants to go further. So she's a tough call for me because, as you said, she does have the best speed figures in here. She has shown some versatility, but most of her best races have come up near the front end. And she is going to face some speed from Miss Marissa to her inside. And you mentioned that we have a few horses stretching out. We also have a few turning back, and Miss Marissa would be one of them, who's been running, which you don't see very often. Most of her recent races are all at a mile and an eighth. She even won the mile and a quarter Delaware handicap. So this is going to be quite a different race dynamic for her as well. And she's a close third choice on the morning line. So this race was a puzzle for me. I think there's some horses in here that I don't particularly like at all. They just look too slow to me. And the intriguing horse to me is Sharp Star, a horse I know you liked on our forecast the last time she ran, or maybe it was a race preview. I don't remember which it was, but she hasn't had the speed figures lately to keep up with some of these horses. But what I do like is that she's won over this Aqueduct surface before. Some of her best races came over it. And it was during that time when Aqueduct was really slow. And it looks like that's the path we're headed down this year because we're getting a lot of really glacial final times for some of these races. And I think she's the one that intrigues me the most.
Yeah, I'm going to take a stand against Lady Rocket here. She's probably going to be a short price. I am never one that wants to side with favorites that are trying something for the first time. And as you were kind of alluding to at the start of this, Craig, there are a lot of short prices that you could land on in the sequence. It's definitely the kind of pick five where you could handicap it and come out with a ticket that's all favorites. And that's not the route that I want to go. So this is the one where I'm going to try to catch a better price, and I'm going to leave Lady Rocket off most of my tickets. I think Sharp Star is very interesting. Maybe she's just one of these horses that sort of comes alive in the fall and winter months, because her performances during the summer, they have not been nearly as fast. And also perhaps Aqueduct is just the track that she really prefers, because she ran some big races over this course last year. She's actually the defending champion in the Gopher Wand. She did win that race over a sloppy track, and all of her stakes victories have come over wet, sealed tracks. So that's something that you do want to know. But she ran that huge speed figure when she had that 16 length allowance win over a fast track at Aqueduct going this distance last year. So, I mean, she's a tough horse to kind of get a gauge on. You never know what you're going to get from her. She's a little bit in and out, but she did wake up last time in that Empire Distaff. She did not win that race by some fluke. She was much the best that day. So I think that perhaps she's turned things around for Horacio de Paz. And I kind of didn't know what to do with the rail horse, Miss Marissa. I feel like she's better when she can set more controlled paces in those two-turn races, but I wonder if they're going to be somewhat worried about the distance with Lady Rocket. Maybe they're not going to be that aggressive with her, and then maybe Miss Marissa can control the pace here, breaking from the rail. I wouldn't say that I love her, because she is coming off sort of a perplexingly bad effort last time in the Turn Back the Alarm, but she's definitely one that should be a decent enough price and has the speed figures that put her on par with Lady Rocket when she does show up. My top pick, though, Craig, is a horse that I want to get your take on, is the number 3 Bella Vita, who's coming in from California. She's actually a California bred filly for trainer Simon Callahan. She has run in some Calbred stakes recently. Last time she won the Betty Grable at Del Mar going 7 furlongs. And the thing that intrigues me about her is that I feel like she's been finishing off her races much stronger since they've stopped riding her so aggressively in the early going. They've been taking her back off the pace a little bit more, something they did 3 back at Del Mar when she made a big move from further back in the pack to win going away by over 4 lengths. Got a solid speed figure that day. That's a number that really does check out when you look at some runbacks. And then last time out, I mean, she regressed on a TimeformUS speed figure standpoint to 105, but she was a convincing winner that day. She really flew home through the stretch to take that, and she was just in a dirt sprint where they went so slowly early that it was never possible to achieve a faster final time figure. You can't earn a fast speed figure when you run your opening quarter in 23-1 over a track that's relatively fast. So I think she's coming into this race in deceptively strong form, and the fact that Simon Callahan is bothering to ship her across the country for this race, I think, is pretty meaningful, because he's not a trainer that ships to New York that often. And I found some stats in Formulator that make me pretty interested in Bella Vita. Going from dirt sprints to routes in graded stakes, Simon Callahan is 4 for 12. That's a pretty small sample, but 33%, the 326 ROI. And perhaps more meaningfully, with last out winners in graded stakes on dirt, Simon Callahan is 12 for 38, 32% with a $2.40 ROI. I mean, you rarely see trainers with positive ROIs or good win percentages in graded stakes, period. And the fact that he has such good stats in a large sample with horses coming off victories, I think really speaks to the fact that Simon Callahan knows that you have to strike while the iron is hot in these graded stakes races. And I just think Bella Vita is coming into this race in good form. So she's going to be my pick here. And I would hope to get around that 5-1 morning line, because like Lady Rocket, she's got to prove that she can handle the stretch out in distance, but at least she'll be a fair price, whereas Lady Rocket's going to be the favorite.
Yeah, this is one I was really on the fence on. I wasn't sure to do what to do with her. Like you said, I think that 112 speed figure she ran 3 back was completely legit. I think the race last time was a lot better than the speed figure shows. She got a 105, and that was even with a pace boost. We used that P notation, but I think she obviously ran much better than what that number shows. The pace was just really, really slow that day, all the fractions in blue. And she was able to overcome it, not just overcome it, uh, but she won easily. There was little doubt she was going to win. She looked like a winner all throughout. And why I bring that up is it showed that she is able to rate, and that's something that usually indicates a horse will be able to stretch out pretty well. So I've got no problems with all with Bella Vita, and in fact, you might have swayed me where I said I was on the fence. I think I would definitely use her.
And just to kind of wrap up the race, once again I'll be interested to see who ends up riding this horse with Joel Rosario not able to take this mount. That's going to be a theme for me as we continue on with this podcast. You'll notice that I've picked a lot of Joel Rosario ridden horses, so I'll be eagerly anticipating those jockey changes that'll probably come out tomorrow morning. Let's move on to race 8, Craig, the Grade 2 Remsen, the first of two two-year-old stakes, going a demanding mile and an eighth distance. Always a tough trip for these two-year-olds to negotiate at the ends of their juvenile seasons. You really need a horse that has plenty of stamina. We've got a couple of horses in here from Powerful Barns, Todd Pletcher and Shad Brown, that are probably going to take the bulk of the play, both of them coming off maiden victories, the number 1 Mo Donegal and the number 7 Zandon. Craig, when I handicapped this race, I felt like these two were kind of standouts. They looked like horses with real promise. I think they both have plenty of ability. And this is a race where I thought that some others, they just haven't quite shown that they're of this quality yet.
Well, we're on the same page because I couldn't get past those two at all. I tried to make a case for some others, like From Another Mother has ran some decent speed figures, but it's still a maiden after 4 starts. It has one of the losses came to Judge Davis, another to Mo Donegal. Has been on the front end, had clear leads and couldn't win. So I just couldn't get there. None of the others have speed figures that really match up with these two. So for me, I'm going to be going only 2 deep. And that said, of the two, I actually much prefer Zandon from the Chad Brown barn. And it just comes from watching the replays. I was really impressed with what he was able to do in his win. He overcame a lot of things that I think would cause many 2 year olds, especially in their first start, to just kind of give it up. He didn't have the best start. He was kind of pinched in behind horses, couldn't get clear, was able to work his way out. And there were a couple points in the race where I just really liked the acceleration that I saw. Some came after the start where he was able to make a quick move to get into contention. And the other came when he got clear and he just found another gear. Whereas to me, Mo Donegal seems like more of a grinder, which isn't necessarily a negative when you're going a mile and an eighth. But I just think Zandon's going to have a bit of a tactical advantage in here, get the jump on him, and just really like that debut. So I'm going to use them both, but it won't be in equal weights. I would use Zandon a little more heavily.
Yeah, I would say I'm kind of two minds about these horses. I do think Mo Donegal is more cut out to get the mile and an eighth distance. As you were saying, he's kind of a grinder type. He's gonna run all day. He's by Uncle Mo. There's a ton of stamina breeding on the dam side, and you could just see that coming through in his last race when Irad Ortiz had to ask him from a long way out, but he just kept finding more. It looked like From Another Mother had built up almost an insurmountable advantage in mid-stretch, but Mo Donegal just kept running after him, and he galloped out strongly past that horse. So I think that he's the one that I kind of know is going to get the mile and an eighth. I'm less sure about it with Zandon because he's got a pedigree that really is not that convincing for the distance. I mean, the upstarts, we've seen a couple of them go longer, but the majority of them have been more precocious miler to sprint types. And the dam side, there really is not very much stamina breeding at all. That said, I'm willing to put aside the pedigree a little bit because I do think it's a real positive that Chad Brown is willing to stretch this horse out from 6 furlongs all the way to a mile and an eighth is just a second career start. That's not a typical move for Chad Brown, and he's gave some quotes saying that he's pretty confident this horse is going to get the distance based on the way he trains, and I'm just going to trust in Chad in this situation because he typically has a pretty good handle on where his horses belong, and I obviously, Craig, agree with everything you said. I forget if we talked about this race on the Pacecast or not, but I know I highlighted this horse in my Horses to Watch segment that I do. I was really impressed by the way this horse overcame some adversity first time out, finished up. And if you want to talk about a good gallop out, I mean, watch the way this horse galloped out in his debut, way ahead of the field. He's just got a real nice, beautiful stride on him. And you saw it in his workouts leading up to that race. You saw it last time. And I'm hoping he gets the kind of trip that the pace projector indicates where he can sit right off the speeds. I don't anticipate they're going to be going that quickly up front, and that gives me some hope that Zandon will be able to use that turn of foot that we saw first time out and maybe get the jump on Mo Donegal, because when I look through this race, Craig, aside from Another Mother, I don't see too many horses that are going to be gutting for the front end here, especially considering that all these 2-year-olds have to get a mile and an eighth.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. And just one thing to keep in mind when you said about the pace is once again, this track is pretty slow. So if you see a 49-3 or even a 50 pop up, it doesn't necessarily mean that it is a slow race because we've seen a slow pace, I should say. It's just the way this track plays in the winter. It's slow. So I've seen races already this year where the fractions would look slow to the naked eye, and then the race just completely falls apart. So just something to keep in mind. Yeah, and just to close it out from my end, I really do like Zandon a lot in here. I agree with everything you said about Chad Brown. He's not one to place his horses in spots where he doesn't think he has a good shot. So that further bolstered my argument. But I just really like the visual I saw from him.
One more thing I should mention about these two horses are the trainer stats. If you look them up in Formulator, I think the biggest negative with Mo Donegal is you would expect Todd Pletcher to do really well with these horses coming off maiden victories that he's taking a shot in graded stakes with, especially considering how successful he's been in Derby preps over the years. But if you look up those specific parameters in Formulator, last out maiden winners in dirt route graded stakes, Todd Pletcher is just 2 for 44. That's a 5% win rate with a 49-cent ROI. He really has not had much success with this at all. So I think that's a real negative for Mo Donegal because he's the kind of horse that has not been successful at that in that sample. If you look through it, there are a lot of short prices in there, and they've mostly lost. So I'm a little bit concerned about that. Whereas Chad Brown, while he doesn't do that same move very often, he actually has really good numbers stretching out off maiden victories in horses' second starts. So I think that's a little bit of a positive for Zandon. So that's another reason why I kind of sided with Zandon like you did. Let's move on to the other 2-year-old race, this one for the fillies, the grade 2 Demoiselle, going that same mile and an eighth distance. And Craig, I think this one is maybe a little bit more wide open. We've got a couple of horses with graded stakes experience, both Nest and Magic Circle coming out of the Tempted, or I should just say stakes experience. The Tempted is no longer a graded race, though Magic Circle, she did participate in the grade 1 Frisette behind Echo Zulu, 2 back. I think both of these horses, they have some things to recommend. I guess I'd be a little bit more confident that Nest is going to get the distance with her pedigree, but I'm not saying anything clever there because I also think she's likely to be the favorite.
Yeah, I had the same reservations about Magic Circle. There's a lot to like. She's run better speed figures every time out, which is something I like to see from 2-year-olds. She's went from 7 furlongs to 1 turn miles the last two. Now she goes to 2 turns. Her breeding makes that a little bit iffy for me. I would also prefer Nest, but not so much that I wouldn't use one. Uh, I was a little curious about your 3-1 morning line on Tap the Faith. I would like to hear some more about that. She didn't take a lot of money first time out. She won just okay to my eye with just an 89 speed figure. So at a short price, it would take some convincing for me to use her. I'd much prefer the Bill Mott train Nostalgic if we were going to take a horse coming out of a straight maiden race who just didn't have much of a speed figure either, only ran an 88, but she did it at a mile and a 16th. She just drew away through the lane. My one reservation with her is that I'm just not sure what she was beating in here. In that race, it was a very weak field, in my opinion, but she did everything the right way. So she's one I'd be interested in using. But this is one race where I would probably use 3 horses Nest, Magic Circle, and Nostalgic, and probably in pretty even amounts.
Well, Craig, let me convince you on Tap the Faith, because I think that there's a lot to like about this horse. I mean, clearly there were high expectations. I mean, she cost $1.25 million as a yearling. I don't care so much about that, but it does make me want to segue into her pedigree. She's just one of these horses that is bred to run all day. She's by Tap It. The Dam Embellish the Lace won the mile and a quarter Alabama. Embellish the Lace is a half-sister to Travers winner, a Fleet Express. So, I mean, this is not just mile and eighth pedigree. This is like mile and a quarter pedigree. So I feel like Tap the Faith is going to get the distance. And I think, Craig, the thing to focus on with Tap the Faith is not her final speed figure. It's her pace figure line in Timeform US, because It's something you rarely see on the dirt with a first-time starter when the pace is so slow in a route race and you see a horse come home basically like a turf horse. I mean, they really slowed up around the far turn of that 1 mile event. And this is not a race where the timer malfunctioned. I mean, the pace figures that show up in there are based on the posted times. They're correct. Track has confirmed it. They just flew home the final quarter mile, and she was dueling with a horse, Amore, who was a heavy favorite in that spot. That's why Tap the Faith was 6-1, because I think Amore was 1-5 or 2-5 in there, and Amore was coming off a third place finish in the Frisette, where she had actually had some trouble and arguably should have been second in that race. So there was quality in that maiden field, and Tap the Faith just ran that horse down, despite the fact that she was so disadvantaged by the early pace of that race. She did ride the rail the whole way, saved ground, was on the best part of the track, but I still was impressed by the run that she put in, and she galloped out strongly after that, like a horse that's going to relish added ground. And if you're just kind of looking at class lines, I know that Nest and Magic Circle got higher speed figures in the Tempted, but I mean, take a look at Magic Circle's performance too back in the Frisette. She finished behind Amore, and Amore, in my opinion, probably should have beaten her by more lengths because she was steadied around the far turn in the Frisette, and Tap the Faith beat Amore. So I think Tap the Faith, just based on that Frisette class line, stacks up really well at this field, and I trust her pretty much more than anybody to get the distance.
Yeah, I can buy that. I saw the 77 pace figure, and I guess I just kind of overlooked it and saw the 89 and was a little turned off by it. I do worry a little bit that I'm not sure. I mean, don't get me wrong. I do think pedigree matters. I think it matters a little bit less in these 2-year-old races. Sometimes it takes horses like Tap the Faith a little bit longer to really show their best, but you've convinced me. I will put her on my ticket. I'm gonna have to work on it though, because that is basically the 4 morning line choices that we're using, and this one's really perplexing for me. I will say I didn't see anybody else that I was interested in at all. Did you in this spot see anybody that you'd throw in as like a C at a price? Because I couldn't find it.
No, but I do want to ask you about one other horse that you did mention, the other horse with that similar profile, Nostalgic, who's coming off that nearly 8-length maiden win. Just from a speed figure standpoint, I don't know if you've looked at the DRF PPs or the buyer for the race, but this is one where there's a big discrepancy, Craig, between the TimeformUS speed figure and the buyer. This horse just got a 48 buyer for her debut. And obviously, the TimeformUS number, typically there's a 20-point difference between them. In this case, there's a 40-point difference. I'm assuming, I know there's no B notation for breakout in the PPs. I'm assuming this must have been a race that you broke out or did something a little bit differently, because this was an extremely slow race in comparison to other races on that card. It's one of those races that seemed almost too slow to be believed. So I'm not against the TimeformUS speed figure. I think it actually makes more sense for the horses in the race than the buyer does, but I'm just kind of interested in that discrepancy.
Yeah, as you were talking, I pulled up the worksheet because I honestly didn't remember. And this was a race where I had the 7th and 10th race being a lot different than the earlier races on the card. Some horses have run back and have some have confirmed it, some have not. In both of those races, the 8th and the 10th, I personally would find it hard to believe that horse ran a 48 buyer speed, or yeah, 48 speed figure on the buyer or 68 on our numbers. To me, it just doesn't make a lot of sense. So just glancing through the charts pretty quickly for that race and race 10, which came after it, which I used the same variant, I don't see anything that I would go back and change.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure you'd agree that it's a tricky situation for speed figure makers when you've got races with 2-year-old maidens, many of them first-time starters. It's hard to know exactly which direction to go, but I do kind of side with you. And now that I'm looking at the chart, I agree also about the 10th race, that it's a race that I think your figures turned out to be a little bit more accurate with runbacks than the buyer has. So maybe it's one that'll be revised in the future. But I think that 88 does kind of check out a little bit more for Nostalgic. I just preferred Tap the Faith because I thought that she overcame a pace situation, whereas Nostalgic, the race just kind of fell apart in her lap. But both of these are cut out to handle the distance, so I'm not going to be surprised if they step forward enough to get on par with those horses coming out of the Tempted. Craig, let's move on to the final leg of this sequence. It's the feature race on Saturday, the Grade 1 Cigar Mile Handicap. And I love that this race drew such a strong field. I think last year's edition of the cigar was pretty disappointing. I don't know if it was the pandemic or just horses going in other directions, but that was a really disappointing 6-horse field with, Performer and Mr. Buff headlining it, won by the long shot True Timber. I mean, a good feel good story with the winner, but just not the strongest edition of the cigar. That is not the case this year. We've got maybe not the top handicap horses in the country, obviously with Life is Good and Nick's Go not being here, but you've got some legitimate Grade 1 horses that are kind of on the precipice of becoming the top horses in the nation. And you've got four 3-year-olds, 4 older horses, and I'm kind of interested to see this clash between the old class horses and the up-and-comers.
Yeah, this for me is a fascinating race, one of the best ones we've seen all year. Just from we could probably talk about this race for a full show if we really wanted to, going horse by horse, because it would really be hard for me to just dismiss any horse outright. I think every horse in here shows at least some potential to win a race of this quality. Obviously, some have a better chance than others, but there's some horses that intrigue me. Maybe we can just kind of take a couple at a time, go back and forth a little bit. The one that intrigues me the most and will definitely be an A on my ticket is Independence Hall. Um, Normally, I wouldn't like a horse like this very much. He comes out of that Grade 2 Fayette at Keeneland. He set just a dawdling pace on the front end, all the fractions in blue. But he did run a really nice speed figure. He blew away the field that day. It included Coda Honor, who's in here. But what really jumped out for me with him is I've always thought he is more of a one-turn horse, and he just kept getting thrown to the wolves at these longer races. He finished behind Nick's Go. He finished behind Royal Ship and Country Grammar when those two were really good out west. He ran in the Idol and the Santa Anita Handicap. The Pegasus, he ran good again behind Nick's Go. But when you really take a close look at his PPs, he's been best at one turn. I think he's 4 for 5. His one lone race where he just didn't run very well was the Malibu. He didn't show up that day, and I just think he's been crying out for this one turn mile for a long time. It's where his best efforts came as a 2-year old. He ran that huge speed figure in just a second start, winning the Nashua over this Aqueduct track. So I'll start with him. He would definitely be an A for me in this race.
Yeah, I actually have very little to add. I agree with your take on Independence Hall. I think the 1-turn mile is going to be perfect for him. The one other point I'd make about him that's a positive is he's one of these horses that's been based in California for a little over a season now. I actually think he runs better when they ship him outside of California. He's done some of his better running when they go to Kentucky or to the East Coast, to Keeneland or New York. He just seems to handle the East Coast tracks or maybe the colder climates a little bit better than he has in California. And I mean, I can't get over the fact that they ran this horse 1.25 miles twice this year. I agree with you. He wants no part of that distance. He wants to go shorter. I know this is a horse that we've talked about quite a bit on the Pacecast, and we've both kind of been waiting for him to go this shorter distance. So I didn't pick him on top, but I think he's a major player in this race. And since we started with him, Craig, let's go through some of the other older horses before we get to the 3-year-olds. I do also want to get your take on Code of Honor, who was beaten by Independence Hall last time. I know some people think that the turn back could also work for him. And I also want to talk about Ginobili, who's coming off that second place finish in the Breeders' Cup Dirt Mile. Do either of those horses interest you? Because I think Ginobili is one that's kind of the new face coming in from California, could take some money. Code of Honor, he's obviously got a rebound.
Yeah, Code of Honor, I don't want any parts of personally. He's a horse who we all know he was a very good 3-year old. He did had a lot of good races that year, but he's basically been nothing but a disappointment ever since. He just hasn't developed at all. I know you have him 6 to 1 on the morning line. Maybe he'll be that price, but he just always seems to take more money than he should. And I would argue 6 to 1's probably more money than he should because there's faster horses in here. There's horses in better form. So he's one that no, I don't want any parts of. Ginobili's a little bit tougher of a call for me. He had an interesting trip. It almost looked like they were riding for second to me in that race. There was a lot of speed in that race. You don't really see it in the PPs because Life is Good kind of was able to outrun the two Japanese horses in that race. But make no doubt about it, the pace was moving up front, and I think that's where Ginobili prefers to be. So I'm not going to knock him for his race that day. He's had a string now of three in a row, 120 plus time form US speed figures. So I would consider him much more of a contender than Code of Honor. Not that that's a shock based on the morning line, but I don't like Code of Honor at all.
Yeah, I'm not thrilled with either of these horses. I do agree with your take on Code of Honor. I just feel like he has not been the same horse this year. I know we were given some hope when he won that Islam with the 125 TimeformUS speed figure, and that number made total sense at the time. I would say since then, and by the way, Beyer had that race just as fast to give it a 105 Beyer, but since then we've seen runbacks from that race. It's just a number that for whatever reason has not held up over time, and I think you could downgrade it by 5 to 7 points. And I mean, since then, Code of Honor himself has regressed by about that much. I mean, I know we got a decent speed figure last time in the Fayette, but I mean, he was no match for Independence Hall that day. He took a shot at the top of the stretch, and Independence Hall just kind of flicked him away. I just feel like Code of Honor does not have that finishing punch that he did when he was a younger horse. So I'm not as optimistic that he's going to wake up on the turnback as some others are. And Ginobili's a horse that I also just can't quite get into because, I mean, he was no match for Life is Good last time. I mean, he was beaten almost 6 lengths in that race, and it's not like he was some clear-cut second. He just kind of barely edged out Restrained Vengeance, who was closing into the pace, whereas Ginobili took a shot at Life is Good. But, I mean, you know who else took a shot at Life is Good in that dirt mile? 8 Rings, and Ginobili only beat 8 Rings by 1 length in the Breeders' Cup Dirt Mile, and I know that I would want no part of 8 Rings in this race, so I don't know how well Ginobili actually ran last time. And prior to that, I mean, he had run well in the Pan O'Brien, but he just beat CZ Rocket and Flagstaff. And does it kind of bother you, Craig, that this horse has never taken a show on the road, not just outside of California? This horse has never taken a show on the road outside of Del Mar. So I'm a little bit concerned about him shipping all the way across the country to Aqueduct.
Yeah, that does bother me for sure. All of his best races have come there, and when he goes off form, he's bad for sure. So at 7-2, he, if anything, he'd be more like a C type for me. I actually prefer a couple of the 3-year-olds who I imagine we're going to get to next.
Yeah, let's jump right into those 3-year-olds. And I think the one that we have to start with is the horse that I pegged as the morning line favorite, the number 3, American Revolution. And I think in some ways he's the horse to beat in here because he has all the upside. He's coming in, despite being the youngster, with some of the best speed figures in this race. The only question is the turn back to the 1 mile distance. But personally, I'm not as concerned about that as some others seem to be.
No, I was going to make the same point. I think he may actually be better at the shorter distance. He kind of had his hand forced. He had to go in longer distances because that's where the better races are and the bigger money. But I've seen nothing from him to think that he needs a mile and an eighth. He's been able to lay up close to some really fast paces, which I think is a good sign on the turn back. I doubt the pace will be all that much faster in the Cigar Mile than it was in a race like the Pennsylvania Derby or even last time out in the Empire Classic, which was a really quick pace. And I agree with you. I think he's the horse to beat. The only question for me is his price. Is how heavily is he going to get bet? I have no knocks on him at all. I just have a feeling he's going to get over bet because the competition in here is pretty steep.
Yeah, that was my one knock against him, is that I think he is going to be the favorite in this race, and it's such a competitive field. I didn't want to default to a horse that is going to be a relatively short price, but I do think he kind of is the horse to beat, and I think you made a really good point about him being up close to some fast paces in those mile and an eighth races, because I think there's almost this perception that he's going to be out the back door trying to close in this race, and I don't think he has to be that far out of it. He's not going to be vying for the lead, but I think he's going to be somewhere in the middle of the pack in that second flight. So I think American Revolution is very interesting. Craig, a horse that I want to get your take on that I actually sided with as my top pick is Pletcher's other horse, Following C. And I didn't initially think I was necessarily going to go in this horse's direction, but the more that I look through this race, there's pace in here, but there's not a ton of front-running speed in this race. I mean, Ginobili he's a fast horse. He's naturally fast. He's going to be forward, but the connections are usually content to let somebody else go, at least in the opening quarter, but Ginobili. They're not always intent on sending him to the lead. And then you've got Olympiad and Pipeline to the outside. They're also just stalker types. They're not horses that I think are going to be intent on getting to the front end. And following C, the fact that he's drawn the rail and that Todd Pletcher also has another horse in here that's going to be coming from a little bit off it, you think that they just have to send following C. John Velasquez, I mean, he's one rider that gets aggressive in these races. I think that they're going to be going to the front from the rail, even though he's kind of shown just off Ginobili on the pace projector. I'd reverse that just a little bit and put following C in front, and we'll see if he gets the distance. That's the big question. But I'm not going to hold his Haskell against him when he went the mile and an eighth. They tried that off a couple of easy victories in Maiden Allowance Company. They were just asking too much too soon from this horse back in the summer. Since then, he's been battle tested against some tougher competition. I didn't think he ran that bad in the Jerkins. He was dominant in the Vosberg. I think he would have won the Breeders' Cup Sprint if he didn't get into that trouble at the top of the stretch. And now I think they're finding a pretty favorable spot to stretch him out in. I mean, he's got to show up and run a career best race, but I think this horse does have this kind of ability.
Yeah, he's a horse I wish we were in some overseas jurisdictions where trainers would come out and tell you what the plan was. But I think the plan, what one of our mutual friends on Twitter kind of asked me about this race, and he was a little upset that he drew the rail. And my reply was, he's got to go. I mean, it's his only chance. I think if he doesn't go, he's going to be in trouble. Now, I don't think that's going to be an easy trip because he's going to face pressure throughout. Like you said, there's some horses to the outside with speed, all three of them, and Independence Hall is going to get involved probably sooner rather than later. It's not like he's some clunk up closer in here. So I think it's a tough spot for him, but I totally get where you're coming from. He's going to go to the lead. I would think. I agree with you on the pace projector. I think he'd be on front if I was going to manually make one. I'd probably have him about a length in front of the field. And that's going to give him a shot because he's a horse with some talent. Now, I don't think the Breeders' Cup Sprint was the strongest Breeders' Cup we're ever going to see. It was a little bit better than the one the year prior, but it still wasn't that great. But he's a horse who has shown promise throughout, so I've got no issues with him. I actually have to take a shot with a different 3-year-old in here, maybe more as a B type. He's not going to be my top pick, but I think Pipeline on the outside, his last race was just way, way better than what it looks. This is obviously a huge step up in class. He's going from straight 3-year-olds to older horses. He's stretching out in distance, but it's just the horse with the kind of trip he had into that crazy pace where he made a premature move while wide. I have to use him a little bit at the big price he's going to be, and I just think he's going to get a great trip in here. So for me, of the two, I'd probably use Pipeline a little bit more than I would Following C.
No, I mean, as we're kind of getting to the point where we talked about all of them, this is a race where you can make a case for almost every horse in this field. I would say that Plainsman is a little tough for me to make, but the other 7, I could build a case for them. I think you make good points about Pipeline. I would even say that the number 7, Olympiad, another 3-year-old that's stepping up. I mean, he's just all potential. I mean, this horse has shown a lot of talent in his 4 starts so far, and he's one that kind of like Pipeline, he could also take a step forward easily and be right there. He's not that far off these from a speed figure standpoint. So it's just a fascinating race. It's one where, I mean, you won't get to see the board before you play the pick 5, but it is one where you kind of do want to let price be your guide a little bit. I would want every bit of that 5-1 warning line and Following C because I think that he has questions to answer, but I do think with the 2 Pletchers in the race and some other ways to go, he will be a square enough price. And I know you're going to get a big price on Pipeline, Craig, because even though he's trained by Chad Brown, I mean, there were just 2 of the other horses in here that have to take money. So I'm just so looking forward to seeing this race on Saturday.
Yeah, I agree. And I plan on spreading in this one. That's why I want to keep it short in some of the others. Yeah, there's just so many ways to go. So I think we've pretty much covered them all. I totally agree about Plainsman. He's the one I would have a really hard time making in here. But the others, yeah, I couldn't argue with anyone with any pick they made.
Yeah, and just to quickly wrap it up, the lean races for me would be the first leg, race 6. I would lean on Urban Forest, use some of the backups, and then in the Remsen, I would lean on both of those recent maiden winners, Zandon and Mo Donegal. Maybe use From Another Mother as a backup, but I would try to go thinly in those two races, spreading some others. I would take a stand against the favorite Lady Rocket and the Gopher Wand, and I think we covered quite a few horses in the Demoiselle and the Cigar, but I think that you might want to open up your mind a little bit when you get to those last two legs, because I think there are 4 horses that can win the Demoiselle, and clearly a lot of horses can win the Cigar. I would be following C and Independence Hall most heavily.
Yeah, we're pretty similar. I'll be honest, I'll be watching the tote closely for race 6 and see if I can get any clues. If not, I'll just turn it into a pick 4. I think we covered the go for one. We're pretty much on the same page there. You sold me on Bella Vita. The Remsen, I'm really gonna lean heavily on Zandon. If Mo Donegal were to win, I'm going to have to be a lot more right in the other legs because I'm going to use them, but more as a B or C type. And then the others, like you said, we talked about quite a few horses. The Cigar is just a fascinating race. That one I'm going to lean on Independence Hall, but I will use some others, including Pipeline.
Well, hopefully we give out some good ideas on this podcast, Craig. Unfortunately, I believe you're not going to be with me next week to recap, but I know that you have some days off coming. You'll be on vacation for the next several weeks, so we're definitely going to miss you on this podcast, but I have been lining up some guests for next week, so we will do a Cigar Mile recap show. I'm also going to have a guest on the TimeformUS Forecast next week, so there'll be continuing podcasts over the next several weeks, and obviously, Craig, I'll wish you a happy vacation. I'll be looking forward to having you back several weeks from now.
Well, let me correct you. You got one more week with me. I'm more than happy to have some guests or even step aside. I don't mind sitting it out, but I am around if we want to do it with a guest on Friday. And if you already have somebody for Tuesday, that's fine as well.
Oh, okay. I had it wrong in my calendar, so I'll we can transfer my by bidding you farewell for another week. But yeah, we'll definitely revise that, and I'll look at that. Yeah, we could maybe do a 3-way podcast on next Friday and have a guest on. But yeah, Craig. So we'll recap the Cigar Mile when we talk about it next Tuesday or Monday on the Pacecast. So look for that when it comes out early next week. Craig, good to talk to you about these races. As always, remember, you can always listen to these podcasts on DRF.com, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. Wherever you get your podcasts, just make sure to subscribe to the Daily Racing Form channel. Thanks for tuning in this week, and make sure to catch next week's podcasts.